The moonlight barely reached the dimly lit alleyway where Clara stood, her heart racing. The note clutched in her trembling hand was the final piece in a game she never intended to play. Her chest tightened with the weight of the secret she had been hiding, her affair with a man forbidden by every boundary of family and society. Tonight, everything would change. The knock on the door earlier that day had sealed her fate. It was her mother, crying in the living room, whispering about the consequences of the actions Clara had buried deep inside. But Clara was not prepared for what was to come next. With every breath, she felt her life slipping away, knowing that what awaited her was more than just the end of a love affair. It was the destruction of everything she had built, everything she believed in. The door behind her creaked open and she spun around. Clara's hands shook as she stared at the familiar yet foreign face standing before her. Samuel, the man who had once been her college professor, stood in the doorway. His intense eyes locked with hers, filled with unspoken words, regret, desire, fear. They hadn't seen each other in months. The last time they were in this room, the air was filled with promises and stolen kisses. Now all that remained was guilt and uncertainty. "Clara," Samuel whispered, his voice hoarse. "We can't keep running from this." Clara's heart thundered in her chest. She knew what he was saying. She had known the moment she laid eyes on him for the first time, back when they were two strangers, too far removed from the consequences of their actions. But now everything had changed. The affair had started innocently enough. A few glances, some casual conversations about literature and life. They never intended for things to escalate. But somewhere along the way their connection grew, turning into something undeniable, something dangerous. And despite all the warnings, the whispers of disapproval from friends, the judgmental stares from colleagues, they continued to meet in secret, convinced that their love was the only thing worth holding on to. But now, standing in the dimly lit alley, Clara was acutely aware that the love they shared wasn't just forbidden, it was toxic. And in the end, it had the potential to destroy everything she held dear. Clara closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. The city buzzed with life around her, oblivious to the storm brewing in her heart. She could hear the distant sound of cars, the murmur of pedestrians, but all of it seemed far away. In that moment, it was just her and Samuel. She had told herself time and time again that they could make it work. That their love, despite the circumstances, was worth fighting for. But with every passing day, the lies had started to weigh heavier on her shoulders. The truth was getting harder to hide, and Clara felt the walls of her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. Samuel stepped forward, closing the gap between them, his presence magnetic. But Clara recoiled, her heart pounding harder now, her mind warring with itself. She couldn't deny it any longer, what they had was dangerous. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to let go. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this," Clara admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Samuel reached for her hand, his touch gentle but insistent. "You don't have to do it alone. We'll figure it out together." But Clara knew better than anyone. Some things were never meant to be figured out. Some loves were too dangerous to pursue, too powerful to contain. It wasn't just the age difference or the fact that Samuel had once been her mentor. It wasn't the gossip among their colleagues or the judgment that followed them. It was deeper than that. Their love was built on lies, secrecy, and defiance. Clara had always been the good daughter, the responsible student, the one who followed the rules. And yet, here she was, in the arms of a man who had torn all those rules apart. But there was something intoxicating about forbidden love, something that made it feel irresistible. The thrill of getting away with it, the stolen moments that felt like they were taken from a different life. But with that came a deep sense of dread, a knowledge that what they were doing could never be accepted by the world they both lived in. Clara's breath caught as she turned to face Samuel one last time. In the distance, she could see the glow of streetlights flickering in the wind, casting long shadows across the pavement. She felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of her own choices. There was no escaping the truth now. Their love, no matter how real it felt, was built on shifting sand. And in the end, sand always slips through your fingers. With her heart racing and her mind torn between the past and the future, Clara knew that the next step would be the hardest. She was about to make a choice that would change everything. Clara couldn't escape the pull she felt towards Samuel, not even now when every part of her screamed to run. But how could she walk away from something that felt so real, so powerful? How could she deny the connection that had been formed over years of shared moments, silent understanding, and stolen glances? The relationship had begun with small steps, innocently enough. It was just a few late-night conversations after class, a shared drink after work, and laughter in the quiet of their secluded corners. But it wasn't long before the lines between student and mentor began to blur, and Clara found herself unable to resist. Samuel too was drawn to her. He wasn't just captivated by her beauty, but by her intellect, her ambition, her fire. At first they both told themselves it was harmless. Two lonely souls finding solace in each other. But the truth was undeniable now. What had started as harmless flirting had evolved into something deeper, something dangerous. Clara was a young, ambitious woman. She had always been the type to follow the rules, to strive for excellence and to make her family proud. Raised in a conservative household, she had been taught that love was a sacred thing, meant to be cherished and respected. But she had also learned that some things were forbidden, that certain desires were to be buried deep inside. Samuel, on the other hand, was an older man, a man with a past, a man who had seen the highs and lows of life. A seasoned academic, he was a man who had built a career based on respect and authority. He had never thought himself capable of falling for someone so young, someone who was still figuring out who she was. But Clara had something that captivated him in a way that nothing else ever had. She reminded him of his own lost youth, of a time when he too had been full of hope and wonder. The first time they kissed, it was in the quiet of Samuel's office, the door locked, the lights dim. They had both been working late, discussing literature and philosophy, but their words had faded into the background. All that remained was the electricity between them, the unspoken desire that had been growing with every passing second. When Samuel had leaned in, Clara hadn't pulled away. The kiss was everything they both needed in that moment, forbidden, intense, and filled with longing. It felt like an escape, a rebellion against everything that had ever tried to hold them back. For a fleeting second, it was as if nothing else mattered. But deep down, they both knew it was only the beginning of something much more complicated. Every meeting after that only deepened the connection. They exchanged furtive glances in the hallway, stolen moments of touch when no one was looking. But each time they touched, it felt like they were playing with fire. Every second they spent together brought them closer to being exposed. The fear of being found out made the whole thing more thrilling but also more dangerous. Clara began to feel torn. Every time she saw Samuel, she felt both exhilarated and terrified. The guilt gnawed at her, but the desire to be with him overshadowed everything else. How could she feel so alive with him, yet so empty when she wasn't? It was as if she had given herself over to something she couldn't control. Samuel too struggled. He had always been the one in control of his emotions, his actions. But Clara made him feel things he hadn't felt in years: desire, passion, and an overwhelming sense of urgency. He tried to push the feelings aside, telling himself it was just a fleeting infatuation, a momentary lapse in judgment. But he knew better. Clara wasn't just any woman. She was different, and that made it even more dangerous. He began to wonder if they could make it work. Could they find a way to continue their relationship without the world crashing down around them? Or was this doomed from the start? Every time he looked at her, he saw the potential for something real, but he also saw the consequences of their actions. As the days passed, their secret meetings became more frequent. Clara started to lose herself in the relationship, in the passion that Samuel brought into her life. She began to neglect her studies, to ignore the warnings from her friends and family. The once careful woman who had always prided herself on her discipline was now spiraling, caught in a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't escape. Samuel, too, felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The more he saw Clara, the more he realized just how deep their connection went. He wanted to be with her, to show her the world outside of the restrictions they had placed on themselves. But there was always that voice in the back of his mind telling him it was wrong, that they couldn't keep living like this. And yet, despite all the doubt, he couldn't let go. He didn't want to let go. But just as they were starting to convince themselves that they could keep their secret safe, the world began to change. What they had thought was safe, hidden in the shadows, was about to come into the light. It had been an ordinary afternoon when everything came crashing down. Clara had just finished a lecture, feeling the familiar rush of excitement from a secret meeting with Samuel that night. They had planned it, another stolen moment in the shadows. But as she walked across campus, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't recognize the number, but when she saw the voicemail icon, her stomach dropped. The message was short, clipped, and devastating. "We know about you and Samuel." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled back against a tree, the world suddenly spinning around her. The message had come from her best friend, Emma. Her voice was cold, distant, and laced with judgment. It wasn't just gossip anymore. This was real. Someone had found out. Within hours, the entire campus knew. Whispers ran through the hallways and eyes followed her wherever she went. Clara couldn't escape the judgment, the whispers, the cold stares. What had started as a forbidden love affair had now spiraled into something far worse. The backlash came swiftly. The dean called her into his office, his face a mixture of disappointment and anger. He made it clear that Samuel's position at the university was now in jeopardy, and so was hers. The reputation of the institution could not be compromised. They had both violated not just professional boundaries but moral ones. There was no coming back from this. Clara's mind raced as the world around her closed in. She had always been the golden child, the one who followed the rules and did everything by the book. But now she was nothing more than a scandal, a cautionary tale for anyone who dared to cross the line. Samuel had always been the calm, collected figure, an authority in his field, admired by many. But as the truth of his affair with Clara began to spread, he could see the cracks forming in his carefully constructed life. His reputation too was on the line, and his career at the university hung by a thread. It wasn't just the professional repercussions that hit Samuel hard, it was the emotional toll. He had never intended for this to go this far. In the beginning, it had been exciting, an escape from the monotony of his life. But now, everything he had worked for was falling apart. The thought of losing his job, his respect in the academic world, and most importantly, losing Clara in the aftermath paralyzed him. He met with Clara in private, both of them consumed by the weight of their actions. The hurt in his eyes mirrored her own. "We've crossed a line we can never uncross," he said, his voice strained with emotion. "But I can't regret being with you. I just don't know how to fix this." Clara's heart twisted in her chest as she looked at him. He was right. They had crossed a line and the consequences were now irreversible. But despite the guilt and fear that gripped her, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. The most painful consequence, however, was the reaction from Clara's family. Her mother, who had always been a pillar of support, was devastated. When Clara came home that night, the look on her mother's face told her everything. Her mother didn't need to say a word. Her silence spoke volumes: disappointment, hurt, betrayal. Clara tried to explain, tried to make her mother understand, but the damage had already been done. "You've ruined everything," her mother whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Not just for you, for me, for all of us." Clara's father, usually a stoic man, was no better. He couldn't look her in the eye. The shame of the situation weighed heavily on the family. What had once been a close-knit, respectable household was now fractured, torn apart by her choices. Clara felt as if she was drowning in guilt. She had shattered the one thing that had always kept her grounded, her family's trust. As the days passed, the emotional weight of the situation grew unbearable. Clara found herself retreating further into her own mind, questioning every choice she had made. How had something that had once felt so right become so wrong? How had the love she had so fiercely believed in led to this? Samuel's presence brought her little comfort now. When they saw each other, the air between them was thick with tension. They had lost the ability to simply be together. Every glance, every touch, felt like an apology for something they couldn't fix. Clara began to isolate herself from everyone, friends, family, and Samuel. She couldn't bear to face the world anymore, couldn't stand to be the subject of pity and judgment. The life she had once known was gone, replaced by shame and regret. One evening, as Clara sat alone in her room, her phone rang. It was Samuel. He had asked to meet, but she wasn't sure she could face him again, not with everything that had happened. But there was something in his voice, something that made her believe this conversation would be their last. When she arrived at their meeting place, Samuel's face was ashen, his eyes hollow from the stress. "Clara," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't keep doing this. I can't keep doing this." The pain in his words echoed through her, and for the first time, Clara saw the true depth of the destruction their love had caused. Samuel was right. They had reached the breaking point. The love they once shared had now become a prison. But even as Clara stood on the brink of losing everything, she couldn't help but wonder if there was still a chance for redemption, if she could somehow rebuild the pieces of her broken life. The days following the revelation felt like an endless blur of sleepless nights and heavy silences. Clara couldn't escape the constant replay of her mistakes in her mind. The stares from strangers, the whispers from her friends, the disapproving glances from her family. Her world had been turned upside down, and with each passing day, the weight of her actions grew heavier. Samuel was no longer the comfort he had once been. Now, every time she saw him, she felt a deeper sense of regret, as if their relationship had morphed into something unrecognizable. It wasn't just the world around her that had changed, it was her. The woman she had once been, the one who had carefully crafted a life of success and respect, no longer existed. The person who had been so confident and certain now felt lost, her identity shattered. Clara avoided her parents' calls, knowing the disappointment in their voices would be too much to bear. She spent hours staring at her phone, contemplating whether to call them to explain herself. But the truth was she didn't have any answers. What could she say? What could she possibly say to undo the damage she had caused? The calls between Clara and Samuel became fewer and fewer. What had once been a connection full of passion and stolen moments was now filled with silence. Each time they spoke, it felt as if they were both pretending that the love they shared was still there when in reality, it had crumbled under the weight of their actions. Samuel's texts became more distant, more formal. The man who had once made Clara feel wanted, understood, and alive was now a shadow in her life. The guilt weighed heavily on both of them. Clara had hoped that, in time, they would find a way to rebuild, to salvage what was left. But as the weeks passed, she realized that their relationship had run its course. The forbidden love they had sought had led them both down a dark, irreversible path. They were no longer the people they had once been, and what they had built was nothing but a broken reflection of their past. One day, Clara's mother arrived unannounced at her apartment. The strange silence between them had lasted for weeks, and Clara had dreaded this moment. Her mother stood in the doorway, her eyes red from crying, her face a mix of anger and sadness. "Clara," she began, her voice shaking, "you have to face what you've done. You've hurt everyone who cared about you. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about your future, your reputation, and your family's name." Clara felt a lump form in her throat as her mother's words pierced through her defenses. She knew it was true. What had started as a selfish pursuit of love had now evolved into a devastating reality, not just for her but for everyone who had ever believed in her. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Her mother shook her head, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "You may not have meant for it to happen, but it did. And now you have to live with it. You need to decide what kind of person you want to be moving forward." The weight of her mother's words crushed her. Clara had always prided herself on being a person who did things the right way. She had worked hard, sacrificed, and earned her place in the world. But now, all of that seemed meaningless in the face of her actions. She found herself standing at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take. Should she try to rebuild her life, to regain her family's trust? Or should she give up on the idea of redemption altogether? Could she ever truly heal from the consequences of her choices? Clara's mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything. She didn't want to lose herself entirely. She didn't want to be defined by one mistake, but that's exactly what she feared would happen. Her image, her reputation, everything she had worked for, was now in ruins. But deep down, Clara knew that the only way to move forward was to face the consequences, no matter how painful. She had to accept the pain and learn from it, no matter how difficult the journey would be. As the days passed, Clara began to distance herself from Samuel. She couldn't keep clinging to something that was no longer sustainable, no longer healthy. The love they had once shared was now a haunting memory, something that couldn't be recaptured. The hardest part was walking away from Samuel, knowing that the love they had once shared would never be the same. She had to let go not just of him but of the life they had built together. It was the only way to move forward, to rebuild the parts of her life that hadn't been completely destroyed. And so, Clara made a decision. She chose to focus on herself, to rebuild her identity, and to find a way to regain the trust of those she had hurt. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But it was the only choice she had left. Clara spent the following months focusing on her studies, reconnecting with her family, and slowly rebuilding her life. It wasn't an easy process. There were moments of doubt, moments when she wanted to give up. But with each step, Clara began to reclaim parts of herself that she had lost along the way. She knew she could never fully undo the damage she had caused, but she also realized that the only way forward was to learn from her mistakes, to accept that love was complicated, and sometimes the price of pursuing it could be too high.